And thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. By the rocket's red glare. Every year, for the 4th of July, communities large and small across the country, they set off fireworks, of course, to celebrate the 4th of July. These are some of the fireworks that were set off for the 4th of July celebration in our nation's capital this past 4th of July. D.C. every year puts on a great, huge fireworks display. And, it looks like nowhere else in the country. There's the Washington Monument, right? It's on the National Mall. As the nation's capital, 4th of July is kind of a meta holiday, right? It's a bigger deal there than it is everywhere else in the country, and it's a pretty big deal everywhere in the country. But it's the nation's capital. Every 4th of July, there's the big fireworks thing in D.C. There's a parade through downtown with the, bands and the Uncle Sam guy and the fife and drum and all the rest of it. Today, President Trump told reporters at the White House that he is considering a new idea that has just occurred to him, a new idea for America, which is that he is considering that maybe from here on out, there should be a parade and fireworks in Washington, D.C. every year on July 4th. How about that? He mused about this idea to reporters today. He said, quote, "We're thinking about doing something that will perhaps become a tradition, proposing fireworks for the 4th of July, even in D.C. It's a bold idea from the president today. Presumably, this will be followed by an executive order proclaiming that from here on out, we're going to start a whole new calendar year every year on the first day of January. What? Also, he's going to declare that we're going to start a new American pastime, a ball game where one person holds a stick, and then that person runs around a series of bases to come home if the person with the stick hits the ball well enough and hard enough while other people try to catch it and prevent the batter from rounding the bases and getting home. The president will soon come up with a name for that and announce that he has invented this game. Also, he's invented rap music and the idea of taking a vacation in the summer if you're a school kid. I kid you not, the president today proposed to reporters in all seriousness from the White House that he's thinking there should maybe be fireworks and a parade on the 4th of July in Washington, D.C. It could catch on, could become a tradition. The best news about this is that it's not actually a terrible idea to have a parade and fireworks in Washington, D.C. on the 4th of July, as evidenced by the fact that we do always do it every year and nobody minds. People sort of like it. But what's going on in the head of the President of the United States that he thinks this annual celebration should henceforth be attributed to him as if he dreamed it up? I try not to get caught up in this stuff and generally in stuff he says, but the weird vagaries of this presidency are honestly really weird. One of the stories that we are covering tonight that we'll have an update for you on later on this hour is the question of whether or not we're about to have another shutdown of the federal government as of the end of this week because of the president's demand that we should build a wall between us and Mexico. In the lead up to that shutdown deadline at the end of this week, the president last night just started declaring overtly that he has, in fact, built this wall between the United States and Mexico. He has already built it. He's just finishing it up now. See, he got what he wanted. He won. Eventually, he will presumably just give tours on the border, showing reporters and maybe his supporters what looks like a normal section of the border with no wall, and he'll insist that actually it's there, because he built it. And the reason you think you cannot see it, well, he meant that on purpose, because he's so good, he not only built the wall, he built an invisible wall. Oh, and also he said it was always going to be invisible. Don't you remember? You don't remember that? It is easy enough, I do it most of the time, to just ignore what he's saying, particularly when it's patently not true. But it is just bewildering, right? This isn't a dumb movie. This isn't, an old TV show. This is actually our president now in our lifetimes. This is actually our government. It's our country. And this stuff, it does put us in sort of a weird position as citizens. And also for the president's political competitors and his opponents, right? It puts them in an odd situation, too. Just around this latest shutdown threat, Do you point out that he actually has not built any wall at all since he has been president? Do you let him claim that he has, even though he hasn't? Because, I mean, maybe that is just easier. Maybe if he says it enough that he has built a wall, maybe he'll believe that he has built a wall, or at least he'll believe it enough that that will become enough to stop the next shutdown of the federal government. That will allow the government to stay open based on a weird hallucinogenic lie that we've decided to not bother correcting because maybe it's easier. I mean, if we choose to apply that strategy even to him saying he's already built the wall this week, I mean, do we apply that strategy to everything? Do we smile and nod and let him believe what he wants to believe and say what he wants people to believe is true? Yes, sir, you won the popular vote, sir, by a record. Your poll numbers are sky high, and North Korea gave up its nuclear weapons just like you said they would. And campaign finance felonies, those aren't really crimes. And Michael Cohen probably doesn't know anything about what you did, nor does Paul Manafort, nor does your accountant, Alan Weisselberg, nor does David Pecker, your friend at the National Enquirer, nor does anybody else who's been granted immunity by federal prosecutors in exchange for their testimony that definitely, probably has absolutely nothing to do with you. Everything's fine. I mean, do you just say it? I mean, the president flatly proclaims alternate universe stuff all the time. And because of that, you do have the option to ignore it, but that doesn't change the fact that he's president. And when he says stuff that isn't true repeatedly, and you have to reckon with that strategically as to whether or not it should be corrected, I mean, it can be hard to get your bearings as to what we must insist is true, right? And what you might just let go because everybody knows it's fake, but the president is saying it anyway, and who's going to stop him? I mean, here's another one about the Trump Inaugural Committee. As you know, the Trump Inaugural Committee was subpoenaed last week. Federal prosecutors sent a subpoena seeking detailed records and information on donations to the inaugural and spending on the inaugural and whether the twain shall meet. It has been this puzzling thing about the Trump presidency from the very, very beginning. President Trump, of course, followed into office an immediately previous president who had the largest swearing-in festivities ever in U.S. history by a mile. President Obama brought an absolutely unprecedented sea of people to the nation's capital to see him sworn in. It was literally the largest assemblage of human beings in the history of the District of Columbia. And to handle those giant festivities, that giant inaugural event, the Obama Inaugural Committee raised and spent a huge new record amount of money, just over $50 million. As inaugurations go, that was mammoth. It was absolutely unprecedented. But you could see why they maybe needed to raise and spend that much money. I mean, it was something like we'd never seen before. Then the next president was elected, our current president, and his swearing in was smaller. And it was small, actually, not just compared with his immediate predecessor. Trump's inauguration was small compared to most other recent presidents' inaugurations as well. And I'm not saying that to be mean. I'm not saying it to be insulting. I mean, I fully believe if I were sworn into anything in any city in the country, less than half of my own family would show up for the swearing in, let alone the parade. I mean, I don't mean to say this says something bad about him as a president or as I guess, candidate soon to be president at that, or president-elect soon to be president at that point. I don't mean it in a mean way. What I mean is that mathematically, there was something weird about the Trump inauguration. The numbers, whether or not you have feelings about them, they just didn't make sense. I mean, for the giant inauguration for Obama, the biggest ever, they raised and spent, again, about $50 million. For the comparatively tiny little one that happened after that, they spent twice that amount. They spent more than twice that amount. I mean, given what actually happened at the Trump inaugural, how on earth did they account for raising and spending over $100 million on this? I mean, if you take President Obama out of it, because that was such a historical anomaly, for comparison's sake, you could also take the George W. Bush inaugurals. Those were sort of normal size, nothing all that unusual about them. Well, the person who ran George W. Bush's second inaugural told ProPublica about the Trump inauguration, quote, they had a third of the staff we did and a quarter of the events we did, and they spent at least twice as much as we did? So the question is, the obvious question is, where did it go? Obvious question, good question, and now the Trump Inaugural Committee has been broadly subpoenaed by federal prosecutors who presumably will get answers to those questions. And if you regularly watch this show, you'll remember that we have reported on this Trump inaugural story for a long while. Just because from the very beginning it seemed like something was mathematically wrong, something was fishy with the Trump inauguration and the numbers that we could observe around it. One of the things we noticed in our own early reporting on the Trump inaugural is that some of the inexplicable and ultimately unaccounted for money that flowed into the Trump inauguration came in late, came in after the fact. And that's not necessarily a sin, let alone a crime, but it is a little funny. Because by the time the Trump inauguration was, an hour into it, let alone over, anybody who had donated money to that thing clearly would have realized that they had just paid $50 for a $2 jawbreaker. I mean, it was clear as soon as the tractors rolled down the parade route and DJ Ravi Drums kicked off the concert of random buskers who they brought to the National Mall. It was clear that they had over-raised. Right? That they had raised way, way, way more money than this thing could have conceivably cost to put on. I mean, by that point, even the Trump inaugural was promising that they would definitely be giving some of the leftover money to charity because it was so obvious that there should be tons of leftover money. Still, though, even despite that, some really big fat donations to the Trump inaugural came in way after the inaugural was over, weeks and months later. Like, for example, this donation of hundreds of thousands of dollars from the CEO of the largest coal company in America, Robert Murray, who runs Murray Energy, directed this donation in mid-March after the inaugural had happened in January. Same guy later also gave $1 million to a super PAC supporting Trump. And there's been some scandal, some public scandal associated with Mr. Murray and his company and what he has received from the Trump administration since making those big donations. The Washington Post was first to report that within weeks of the inauguration, but interestingly, even before he cut that $300,000 check to the inauguration, Bob Murray had drawn up a detailed action plan for what he wanted the Trump administration to do. Everything from slashing the number of people who work at the EPA to scrapping anti-pollution rules. By the anniversary of Trump's inauguration, the one-year anniversary, the New York Times was reporting that, quote, the White House and federal agencies have completed or are on track to fulfill most of the detailed requests in Mr. Murray's action plan, this coal baron's wish list of 14 or 16 different detailed requests that he was demanding the Trump administration perform. They just did them all. And if that story, that little scandal about Murray rings a bell or at least doesn't come as a surprise, it's because we expect that to be the way of the world a little bit. We certainly expect that to be the way of this presidency. But in a democracy, in a republic where our elected leaders are accountable to the people who give them their jobs, namely the citizens, we the voters, in a real functioning democracy, of course, investigative reporting is a sacrament. Constitutionally enshrined concept of a free press doesn't just mean that you're free to say what's on your mind. It also protects the freedom of us and our fellow citizens to figure things out, to dig stuff up, even when what you dig up is unflattering or scandalous material about the people in charge, especially if that is what you dig up. And so credit where credit is due to the enterprising reporters who have just dug up this new jaw-dropping scandal about this White House and the government being put up for sale. This is the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA. Dates to the 1930s. It's a federal agency that operates as essentially a gigantic mega utility in Tennessee and parts of Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Kentucky, North Carolina, Virginia. Well, now, enterprising reporting has turned up the fact that the president personally has secretly weighed in with that agency, with the Tennessee Valley Authority, that federal agency, to tell them that despite the agency's existing plans, despite that agency's own internal assessment of what's right for that agency, what's right for the states that agency serves, despite all that, the president has told them to not do what they otherwise intended to do, and instead he has intervened personally and directed them, told that agency that they got to use a coal plant, a coal-fired power plant that they were otherwise going to phase out. But he's telling them to keep that coal-fired power plant online, keep using it, despite what's happened at your agency that made you decide to stop using it. keep using it now, because that plant buys its coal from Bob Murray, from Murray Energy, from the president's gigantic donor, both his super PAC and the mysterious late donation to the inaugural. This is like the platonic ideal of simple corruption, right? Murray pays Trump, including paying after the fact into whatever those slush fundy shenanigans were at the inaugural, now under scrutiny by federal prosecutors. Murray pays Trump, then Trump uses the presidency to direct a public agency to pay Murray, to prop up Murray's business. Use federal resources, use the taxpayers' resources, use the country's assets to reward the guy who gave him money. And if what I just described was the way that we had learned about that scandal, if it in fact had been some enterprising, digging, investigative reporter who had turned that up as a secret deal, that would be a Pulitzer Prize-winning scoop for that investigative reporter who uncovered that scandal. But in our morally bewildering current environment, in fact, the way we learned about that scandal is just from the president's public statements on Twitter. It was the president himself who just broke the news of this scandal because he's just doing it all out loud on his Twitter feed. This is his tweet last night, directing the TVA to use this one particular power plant, Paradise Number 3, that gets its coal from his campaign donor. There's the tweet from last night. There's the headline response, agog, that this is happening in the open. And yes, this is the story of another destructive tributary of presidential corruption that is flowing through U.S. government policy out of this White House. But it is also another element in this age of sort of moral bewilderment we are now in as citizens. Right? Because you can't run that story about what Trump just did with the TVA and his donor and demanding that they use his donor's coal plant. You can't run that story as an expose of the president's shocking behavior if the president is happy to commit things like this in public. I mean, there's no way to embarrass somebody for doing something like this if they're happy to be seen selling the government in exchange for cash. And if you can't embarrass or shame anybody about it, and you increasingly can't shock anybody about it, then what do you do with it? I mean, how do you stop specific government actions like this if there is no shame from public officials who are doing it? But also, how do we once again become a country where that kind of thing would at least be a scandal? Right? I mean, if this doesn't get fixed by the next Trump inaugural, presumably they'll just distribute a menu. They'll have a U.S. taxpayer-funded calligrapher draw up a very pretty menu. Will they just offer you know, what you need to pay for what type of presidential tweet or proclamation or policy you expect in return? And then they send somebody out, like with the beer tray from the ballpark, to go collect your funds. I mean, if it doesn't matter anymore, if we're not surprised and nobody's embarrassed, how do we not just become that?
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.